Hello, listeners, and welcome to Freebird Media. It's my pleasure tonight to have a live conversation with Dr. Ricardo Duchesne, who I've spoken with before. He is a historical sociologist from the University of New Brunswick and the author of the best-selling book Canada in Decay, Mass Immigration, Diversity, and the Ethnocide of Euro-Canadians. Professor, thank you for joining me again tonight.
All right, I'm glad to be here again with Freebird Media, and I hope that your media grows,
Thank
which I
you.
think it will.
I appreciate that. So since the last time we spoke, I've talked about your books a lot in different live streams that I've done, and I've definitely had a lot of feedback from people, both positive and negative. I'm sure you expect that. And so through a course of several weeks, I picked out a couple of questions that people were posing in criticizing your books in different ways. And so now that I finally have the opportunity to talk to you, I'd like to ask you some questions that my listeners have sort of been espousing and see how you would respond to them.
All right.
If you don't mind, because obviously they're all related. So of course, in regards to the most recent book, Canada in Decay, it talks about Euro Canadians. So the most common objection people raise to me is that there was already basically a nation state in Canada before the Europeans arrived, and they usually cite the Blackfoot Nation, which I had actually never heard of. So I looked into it, and the Blackfoot Nation is essentially a sort of nation of Aboriginals. So can you tell me why you don't see that as a nation state the way Europeans view nation states?
Well, it is not a nation state in the strict, proper definition of what constitutes a nation. The idea of nations was an invention of Europeans. There were no nations before Europeans, through incredible conflict with each other in Europe, created nation states. And that happened starting in the 16th century through the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. So by that definition, and we can go over that definition, what it means later on, by that definition, the Aboriginals or any people outside the West did not have a nation. Now, that doesn't mean that the Blackfoot people and other Aboriginals did not have territories, lands that they saw as their own lands. After all, the very idea of a nation presupposes that there have been a people living in a territory for a long time. So there is no question that in maybe a few decades, centuries, the peoples that were here in Canada may have formed nation states as that is understood in the modern era. Now, another thing about the Blackfoot people is that if you look at the territory that they claim as theirs, it is contiguous with the United States. It is not really located in Canada, all of it. So if you were to say that they were the nation in Canada before Canada was created, it kind of doesn't make sense because they were not really all together in Canada. So in case, and I guess they do, in case you listeners want to know what it means to have a nation is forged through a long struggle, as it happened in Europe, when a centralized authority claims sovereignty over a territory, and then it taxes that area. It has a unified army for that area so that you don't have feudal authorities with their own armies, with their own judiciaries, and so on existing. Rather, you unify them all. There is only one law for the land. You begin slowly and gradually, this happened in Europe, to forge a national language, a national legal system, a national postal service, transportation, communications across that territory with a flag, and then you demarcate boundaries, borders that designate that nation. Even people on the left will argue that nations did not exist before the modern era. They say they were constructs. Now, my problem with that idea that they were just constructs is that that's half the truth. They were constructs in the sense that human beings actively and consciously, let's say the French, the Spaniards, the English, began to create a sense of unity and cohesion among a people and to say this is Britain, this is France, this is Spain. So in that sense, it is a construct, and they began to pull together what would be the language, because you take France, there are many dialects, and they kind of came up to the decision of what would constitute the official French language, and they started to standardize it. And then they have schools, and they created a standardized education, a unified history. So in that sense, it's a construct. But on the other hand, you have to realize that they constructed on a reality, heroes. So all of these things were pulled together, and that's where the construct comes in. But they were not pulled together out of thin air. It's not as if the French can walk into Spain. The first, that more or less, you take France again, you have people that came to be called French that were inhabiting those lands. And even though they had dialects, there were strong similarities. We're going to construct a French nation here. That's not going to be the case. There were intense struggles along the borders because of that. People claiming, well, you say this is French territory, but actually the majority of the population are disparities in their languages such that they could be pulled together to be designated as a French language. And there were also kinship relationships among those peoples, bloodlines, historical Medians, and their heritage is Italian. So in that sense, they were constructing those nations on the basis of certain objective realities. So I think you have to see it as a combination of both things. Construct on the basis of certain kinship, territorial, historical realities.
I see that. So that makes sense to me. So the Aboriginal communities that were here before were obviously not unified in any standard way, as the Europeans would be. What about the claim that leftists would make that they're the de facto owners of North America because they were here first? So there's still the same argument that the Europeans had no right to settle the land, I guess, that's how the Marxists would put it.
Well, by the standards of today, which are the standards that the Europeans themselves created, you cannot go to another land, take it over, and claim it as your own. Particularly after the Second World War, there is a sense in which the nations of the world, under the initiative of the Europeans and the North Americans, decided that you cannot just walk into other lands and just by force claim them as your own. So by those standards, yes, you could argue that the Europeans didn't have a right to this land, but those are not the standards that apply throughout history. And if you were to apply those standards across the world, then the whole mapping of the world would have to change, including that of the Aboriginals. They themselves struggle intensively among each other for land, for territories. Who knows what exactly were their lands? You take the Blackfoot. They kind of, if you look at a map, they say these are our lands. Well, I'm sure other people could claim that used to be our land before you took it away from us. And they say that the Blackfoot people were very good as warriors. So I would imagine that they expelled quite a few people, they took it over. So that has been the standard, the practice throughout history. So if Europeans want to apply that only to themselves, which is what is happening, the Chinese don't apply that to themselves. The Chinese, if you look at the original Han people, the ethnic Han people, which is the dominant ethnic group in China, over 90%, they were restricted to a small area in what is China today, and then slowly and gradually they expanded demographically throughout that entire area. So what should they do? Should they give up all those lands? The same thing with really practically every nation in the world. So I don't think that really is an argument. Another point that I would make is that Europeans should stop thinking that they can be the speakers of the Blackfoot people. This is a habit among the left, and including people in the mainstream conservative side. They have a tendency to kind of qualify whatever thoughts they have that may seem politically incorrect, to say things like, oh, well, you know, the native people should have this land and should have that. let them speak for themselves and let them claim that territory for themselves. It is not as if Europeans somehow have some moral mandate to be legislating around the world as to, oh, these people should have that land, these people should have that land. That's very arrogant. It is for them to make that claim and to fight for that claim. It is not for Europeans to be fighting for Blackfoot people. They're not children.
I agree with you on that 100%. So that clarifies that for me then. Moving on to the next question. This is an interesting one that I get a lot when I talk about the uniqueness of Western civilization. So I have a friend in Toronto, and he is part of a patriot group that's called Rise Canada, and he himself is a Hindu nationalist, and he takes issue with your work, and he comments a lot on my wall that the West should be expanded to include Aryans like from India and outside of just the European West. And he cites Hinduism and a lot of Vedic philosophy and things like that as being sort of part of what he calls the Aryan canon, I guess. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it is true that Indo-Europeans who originally came from what is called Ukraine today expanded into Europe and into northern India as well as into Persia. And so there is that connection that we Europeans have with the people of India in the northern side and with the people of Persia. And you can see it that they have certain, if you like, Aryan characteristics. Certain Indian people have Caucasian white features, and certain Iranian peoples. When you compare Iranians, say, to Iraqi people, you can see the difference between them. So there is that kind of connection. But the peoples that move into Persia and that move into India, the Indo-Europeans, they really arrived at areas that were heavily populated, had been there for a long time in a civilized state of existence, and they were gradually absorbed by that whole landscape, environment, culture, and they developed in a very different direction without that many contacts between Europe, where the Europeans also settled, and Persia and India. So when you look at the history of the West and you look at the key major transformations in European history, like the Greek so-called miracle, Rome, the Christian Catholic medieval period, which is an incredible period of creativity and new developments, the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the English Revolution, and so on. Those are things that are only happening in what we call Europe today, and they're not happening at all in Persia and not in India at all. So they are out of the orbit of Western development. They don't experience any of these things. So they're very different peoples. When you look at a map and an atlas today, and the way any atlas today defines the territory of Europe is actually quite accurate. Basically, is the region that today, when you look at the map, it includes Belarus, the Ukraine, the Baltic states. Now Russia is kind of outside of it. When Belarus and Ukraine were part of Russia, so that area was kind of part of the West, not part of the West, because Russia has always been ambivalent. Are they in Asia? Are they in Europe? And they're kind of in both continents. So I would argue actually that Russians are Western peoples. For one, they're white and also they're Christian. And they came under the influence heavily, particularly after Peter the Great in the early 1700s, of Western developments. So I would argue that they are Western. But when you look at a map and an atlas of what is Europe, it is quite accurate. It is everything: Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Romania, Hungary, the Baltic states, Germany, all the way to Portugal. And then After that, when the Europeans moved into Canada, Australia, the United States, and New Zealand, that's the Western world. The left, the postmodernist left, has played all kinds of tricks on the mind of students. All across our universities, not only do they not teach the West anymore, but they kind of say the West doesn't exist. This is a typical argument they make continuously. Whites don't exist. The West, what is the West? Where is the West? They play games because all concepts are fuzzy on the edges. All concepts.
Right.
The very left that talks about capitalism all day doesn't want you to know that capitalism, what is it, is also fuzzy on the edges. Every concept is fuzzy, including the concepts that they use.
Right.
But the West, even though it's fuzzy on the edges, and when you look at the history of the West, it's even trickier to determine exactly where is the West. I wrote about this in my book, Faustian Man. And I think the answer that I gave is a reasonable one, that all in all, we know the core of the West is Europe. The Roman Empire expanded into North Africa. It expanded into what we call the Near East today. But it is interesting that once the Romans are expelled from that area, those areas are not Western. They barely were able to impact them because those were very different people. They did not feel an attachment to the West. One of the things I always find interesting is why is it that the Romans felt this kind of inherent, intimate link to the Greeks, that they welcomed, they conquered them, and then they welcomed them, many, many teachers, philosophers, to bring their knowledge, their education, and then they came under their influence. The Romans conquered many other peoples, but they did not feel that kind of kinship attachment. They did feel a kinship attachment to the Greeks because the Greeks were Indo-Europeans like them, they were aristocratic like them, they were increasingly the Greeks republican, like the Romans would become. So they felt that attachment, that sense of individual liberty as it was understood at that time. So the West to me is a very clearly demarcated geographical and cultural area. The left wants to break it down, deconstruct it, so that white people have no sense of identity, no sense of place, and then their lands are easy to be occupied and taken over. That's their goal.
Right. I agree with you 100% on that. Since the last time I spoke with you, I've been sharing passages on my Facebook wall from Faustian Man, and I witness that on a daily basis. Leftists and progressives and cultural Marxists will comment, and it's ironic because the same people who tell me that as a white man I have this white privilege will simultaneously tell me that race doesn't exist, and they'll criticize your book and they'll say, well, you know what, when Greece and Rome were in their heyday, the Germanic people were savages, so why would you assume that we can't just grab any group on the planet and do this, do the same process to westernize them? And so I know that you're 100% correct that basically they play that game of taking the fuzziness on the fringes of any concept and just hitting that home until they've invalidated things that are nonetheless still a very obvious part of everyday life for normal people, which I find to be a very interesting trait. And I agree with you that it's a quirk of, I think, European people to have this hyper... whites are obviously very critical of the idea of white racial identity, of their own identity, more so than other racial groups. So I think that actually brings me to another question I had for you, which was, let me just see in my notes here. You do touch upon this in the uniqueness of Western civilization, and this is a concept that a lot of people don't agree with that I've been talking to, but well, you've said progressives often make the claim that at one point in history... Sorry, that's actually a separate question. Could you elaborate slightly on your views on why you believe Europeans may have evolved a higher tolerance for individuals standing out from the crowd? In other words, the lack of group identity might be a unique trait of of Europeans, and if that's so, why do you think it evolved in Europe specifically?
Well, that's a very complicated question to answer. Ultimately, what one is trying to understand, as I see it, is why the West was so different for such a long time, since prehistoric times, in my view. The standing argument right now is that the West was different in becoming industrial first, and then some people will say, well, it became industrial because it developed modern science. So what makes the West different is modern science and the Industrial Revolution. But I think that's a very limited understanding of what makes the West different, and that you have to go back through the entire history, because the West was by far the most creative civilization in human history. Since uniqueness, more recently, after I wrote the book Canada in Decay, I have been going back to what makes the West different. And I still haven't pinned down the answer. I tried any uniqueness, and I think I was on the right track, that I said that ultimately it comes down to the aristocratic culture of Indo-Europeans. And people can read about that, but there is more to it that I've been investigating recently. But I'm not going to get into that right now. I will simply say that the West has been unique for a long time. If you look at ancient Greece, for example, they invented deductive geometrical reasoning. They invented prose writing. Prose writing is a type of writing in which you engage in argumentation. You use a lot of therefore, if, accordingly, if someone says this, then this follows. You're not stating views. You realize that you're going to have to make a case. You're going to have to argue your way through various obstacles in order to make your view amenable or appealing to other people who expect you to explain yourself, expect you to draw evidence, to be logical. So prose writing is associated with a style of reasoning, and that was invented by the Greeks. The Greeks invented tragic writing. You don't have tragedies unless you have individuals who have a sense of freedom to struggle for that which is highest, but you encounter the limitations that we all have as human beings, and the fact that when you struggle for that which is highest, you ultimately will pay an incredible price, whether it is that you're going to live a short life. In those days, in ancient Greek times, and you see this in Achilles' hero of the Iliad, he wants to be the greatest warrior of all. But that obviously means you're going to put yourself continuously at risk. And he knows that. He continually says that. I will die a very young life. Alexander the Great, who carried the Iliad with himself throughout his conquest of the Persia, he understood that, and he died at a very young age, because you put yourself out there. So that is really what tragedy is that that which we value the most and which we think is the greatest is also that which brings a lot of suffering, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of ultimately death. It's not going to be, if you want to do something, you're not just going to lie down and live a long life and have a nice meal every day. That's not the way it's going to work. You put yourself out there, and there's a lot of risk. So the Greeks invented tragedy. They invented, really in many ways, not fully, of course, but the beginnings, the elementary beginnings of the scientific method. Now, if you go to the Hellenistic Greeks, which is after classical Greek goes down, this is after Alexander the Great creates his empire, and Alexander the Great dies sometime like around 325 BC. So during the 4th century and the 5th century, not 5th, during the 4th, the 3rd, and the 2nd BC centuries, you have the Hellenistic Era. It's a period of incredible scientific creativity among the Greek peoples. You have Euclid with his geometry. You have Aristarchus, who conceptualizes the Copernicus theory of the planetary system. And then you have other people who even measure in a very accurate way the circumference of the Earth, and other people in geometry, trigonometrics, and so on. So the Hellenistic period is a very creative period in Greek history, and so on. So the Greeks already were immensely creative, and they set themselves apart from all other peoples. The Romans, in my view, they do as well. not intellectually as much as the Greeks, but they do with their own legal system and other kinds of engineering works, and the fact that they create an incredible empire in an area of the world that it is the most difficult to create an empire, because the Mediterranean world was the most contested area of the world at that time. So it goes on and on. So my argument is that the West has always been incredibly unique, and to try and understand why is that the case is very difficult. As I said before, one of the arguments that I make in uniqueness is that we have to go back to the aristocratic culture of Indo-Europeans, that the Indo-Europeans were the only true aristocratic society in history. And by that I mean that you have a ruler, but the ruler is not a despot, doesn't expect submission from the closest upper class men. The upper class men have a sense of pride, a sense of independence, a sense that, yes, I'll follow you, show me how great you are, but I'm free, I'm not so Serbian, and I will never bow down to you. Alexander the Great, at some point in his history, was influenced by the Persians. He expected some of the Macedonians to prostrate in front of him, and they started laughing like, "What, are you kidding us? You think we're going to do that?" So you have that element in ancient European history. But I think there are other components, and one of the things that I'm looking into right now is that Europeans develop a sense of self, and that having a sense of self, that you're a separate being with an identity that can be distinguished from your body, your mind can be distinguished from your body, your thinking self, and that you can distinguish yourself from the enveloping world around you and the traditions and customs around you, is the origins of an ability to be able to think independently and to develop this incredible philosophical tradition that you see in the Greeks and then through the history of Europe. Ultimately, I think I will argue that, and this seems outrageous, but that the Europeans became conscious in a way that other peoples did not become conscious. To be conscious, you have to be able to separate your thinking mind, your thoughts, and what your mind legislates and thinks through from that which is outside, so that you don't let yourself be overwhelmed and taken over by the natural world, by your emotions and your body. And the Europeans did that. And that kind of is a form of individualism and separation. Has made Europeans to this day believe that all individuals can be that way. I don't think so, and I think that's a mistake. I think that the people that are coming to the West, yes, they have been influenced by Western ways of doing things, and the modern world in and of itself promotes individualism, so that has affected them. But they're still very collectivist. They still think in terms of their kin group, in terms of the interest of the group. They're not like Europeans who are very individualistic. Europeans are projecting their individualism onto other people, but they don't have that to the same degree.
I agree with you very strongly on that, and part of that is I feel through experience that I've had, but a lot of people reject that idea. It's very hard to make an argument that the uniqueness is a biological trait, because people accuse you automatically of being a genetic determinist or something like that. So I understand it's hard to make that argument conclusive, but I do agree with you that there is something unique about the West and that's evolved in Europe and Europeans. So I'm very sympathetic to that idea. I think you're spot on, and I encourage anyone who's listening to this right now to get copies of Dr. Duchesne's books, because I think they're very relevant in our current climate of historical revisionism that cultural Marxism brings. Professor, I'm assuming that you would agree with me that there's definitely a cultural Marxist agenda to rewrite history in academia. And can you elaborate, as you have in your books, a little bit on why you think that developed after, I guess, after World War II, and more strongly in, I guess, the 60s, that Western tendency to not want to be Eurocentric in the way we represent the rest of the world?
Yeah, there is no question. I mean, it is so strongly anti-Western that the teaching of Western civilization has been abolished except in a few Christian conservative colleges and universities. It used to be common. It used to be seen as a requirement for all history majors, and including BAs, that students should be acquainted with the history of the West. But it has been pushed to the side. And right now, we are dealing with a situation in Canada in which indigenous studies are being promoted heavily in the last year, 2 years. It's not just a matter of teaching a course, 2 courses, which has been a standard practice for some years now. It is that they're saying that for students to claim that they have a BA, they must be well acquainted with indigenous culture and indigenous history. Not with Western civilization, not even with British history. That's not even that important. So they're really pushing this, because the way academics see this is that this is a way to compensate for the crimes they committed. It's a way to elevate indigenous peoples to a higher level, to make them attracted to universities, because to this day they don't do well in our universities. They are not members of the physics department, of the mathematics department. Asians are taking over those departments. So they have to do that as a way to compensate, even though the teachers, the vast majority of the teachers who are teaching indigenous history are not indigenous, they're whites. So it's like ridiculous. They don't even realize what they're doing. Whites teaching about indigenous history, pretending that they have some sort of inside knowledge into their ways that supposedly indigenous people do not have. I mean, if they were really serious, why not hire indigenous people? And if you think they're not qualified because they don't have PhDs, well, are those not Western standards? They never had a PhD or a BA in indigenous cultures. What are you imposing that standard upon them? Why don't you just let them teach it according to their own criteria of what constitutes knowledge? They will not do that. So it's all hypocrisy, it's all lies. So in our universities right now, the West is really condemned. I mean, you do have guys who teach French history, British history, and some of them are pretty good and they do what they have to do. But overall, the climate is not positive. So they cannot be denied, I think, that students come out of a BA without having a sense of how important, in the case of Canada, Britain is to Canada's history and identity. And beyond Britain, Europe, they have no sense of that. Also, as I argue often, the reality is that if you study the West, you're going to learn a lot more than if you study any other civilization, because that's where modern science comes from, modern technology, the Renaissance, literature, philosophy, painting, is all at the highest level. Classical music is not to be found anywhere else, and it's the highest, most complicated form of music you can find. That's the reality. So you really learn a lot. I realized this when I was a BA student, that I would study Chinese history, Mexican history, African history, and I was a leftist, but I kind of knew when I was studying European history that something big is happening here. This is like really important. You see the development of nation states, you see the discovery of the world, you see the bourgeois revolutions happening there. So all the stuff is happening there, and then in the other nations after the Bronze Ages, with some exceptions, you see just repetition. So it is really very bad that the West has been pushed out of our universities. So to your question, yes, the West has been pushed out of our universities. I forget the second part of your question. It was...
Oh, just when did this become such an agenda, and is it basically guilt alleviation, or is it the main cause of why these academics are so against the West?
Yeah, at this point, it is an effort to teach things that are compatible with the diversification of the West. The fact that increasingly you have classrooms that are populated by people from Asia, from Latin America and Africa, they realize, why would they want to be, why would we just teach them about the West or Canada? We need to teach them their history. And if you teach the West, if you teach Western history, then teach it in such a way that they feel they are part of it, that the West speaks for everyone, that the West was created by everyone. That was a new thing when I was a PhD. No, when I was already a professor in my early years, I noticed that. I noticed how come they keep saying that the West was created by Africans and Arabs and so on, when the evidence doesn't show that. And I realize now that the reason for that is that makes the West belong to everyone. So you walk into a classroom and you go, guys, this is a civilization for everyone. Don't you know that? It's the universal civilization. And you guys were major participants in the making of the Renaissance. So they found a few bones in England from a guy from Arabia, and they say, you see that Britain depended heavily on Islamic peoples. Honestly, that's the kind of stupidity that they are arguing. I just read about that recently. Just a few bones they found of someone that they could trace to the Near East, and they go, oh, you see, they were part of the making of Britain. Africans were central and key to what Britain became, all of which are lies. They were not central. They were not even marginal. They were just not at all a part of the making of Britain. If they mean that Britain is connected to the rest of the world, yes, it is, and so is every other nation. But they never said that about the Chinese. They never say, by the way, Saudi Arabians, you were connected to the rest of the world, and when you expanded across the world, imagine what would his so-called Islamic knowledge have been without the Persian background, without the Roman background, and the Greek background. They don't say that about them in that open way. In fact, they say the opposite. Oh, you Western people, what would you be without the Islamic peoples? So it's always a double standard. And it's hard for people to understand that because they don't study the West. And the people who are writing about the West now, they are sellouts and they're just lying, and that's what they do. So it's very hard. So that's what I'm saying, that I hope that people can see through all of this.
Right. I think that it's hard because like I'm 32 and I have an English degree and I graduated from Carleton University about 7 years ago. So that was when the real cultural Marxism was just like, it's sort of been there subtly all along, but it was just starting to pick up more. And I was definitely in. So I had an English degree, but to get a BA in English from Carleton only required a few basic courses in like Shakespearean lit, for example, or European stuff. But mostly it was courses like African lit or Aboriginal lit. And I took 3 courses in African literature, which was confusing because there's a small amount of work in that genre because Africans have only been writing novels in English for 40 years or so. And there seemed to me as a young man that I was confused because they were sending mixed signals in the course, because a lot of the books tend to deal with colonization of Africa and how oppressive that was, while simultaneously talking about things like female circumcision. And so I couldn't figure out if on one hand, when I was younger, I saw colonization as bad because you're taking over other people, and then on the other hand, these places seem so barbaric on their own with all the circumcision and things like that going on that I felt that there would be a moral obligation to stop it. So I think that in academia now, young kids are just completely brainwashed because they're not getting any of the actual information that people need to expose. Like you're writing books on these topics, but can you recommend any other professors or writers that write about the West in a more Eurocentric and honest way than as opposed to cultural Marxist lens?
Yeah, I could recommend them. Sometimes there are quite a few, and it's hard to sort of just quickly come up with titles. I have a lot of those titles reference in my book Uniqueness and in other books. What I would say is that there are some solid, if you're introducing yourself to Western civilization, the best book to read is not my own book because it's meant for a graduate level. Uniqueness. Faustian Man is meant for lower level, but I would recommend a good textbook, old-fashioned textbook on Western civilization, and there are a few of them. The more recent ones are now saying things like the West includes the Near East because that's what you're expected to say. So don't choose those. Let me see the name. Oh, it's his name just escapes me now. There is a multi-author book which I use for my courses. I know the other names are Osment and Kagan. Yeah, that's his name. The family name is Kagan and others. And I would suggest to people just read a survey so you get a sense, a sweeping sense of Western civilization. An old-fashioned one, which means one that is kind of older. It has now many editions, so you have recent editions, but originally it may have been published in the 1980s. So I would say that's a very good starting point. Then there are other books that I have read. I mean, just recently I was reading a book by Bruce Snell, The Discovery of the Mind, which is about the ancient Greeks, but that might be a bit difficult for people who are just introducing themselves. There's another one, The Passion of the Western Mind. It's an intellectual history that is quite good. His name escapes me now. People's names are starting to escape me because I have so many in my mind. But in any case, they can write to me. I have gotten that question a few times through emails, people who advise me, and I list about 7-10 books that they should read that I think are good. Yes, it's really, see, universities should be dedicated to that which is highest. It's called higher learning, but that's not what they're doing. That which is highest is that which was produced by the West. If you really value architecture, well, why would you not study Western architecture? If you value literature, poetry, philosophy, it is at its highest among Europeans. Some people will contest me on this, but that's what I think. And I think there's a strong set of arguments to make in favor of that view. But that's what's going on.
I agree with you, Professor, and I was wondering if what you think of this. So Freebird Media was recently the target of a hit piece by the CBC and a progressive outlet called Press Progress, and they labeled us an alt-right website, and they were basically just trying to take a dig at a local conservative MP because she held up one of our Freebird Media hats at an event. And so basically they quoted me, and I had given a speech at this Christmas event where I said that academia was a feminized environment that essentially castrates young men. I was being tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of a joke, but I was wondering, because, then I also said that's not true. I know a few university professors that I still respect. But generally speaking, in my opinion, I think the universities are, what happens is a lot of men who aren't maybe physically very strong or very masculine tend to gravitate towards academia because then they can still achieve a form of social status with their intellect rather than their physicality or their masculinity. And so over time, it builds up sort of an echo chamber of feminized men that drown out the minority of more masculine type men. And that feminized environment is why everything is now being interpreted through like sort of a bleeding heart, empathy-driven lens rather than an actual pursuit of truth. Do you think that that's generally true?
Oh, yes, there is no question about it. I started noticing that when I was getting out of the lab, it may be already 10 years ago. I was walking around the U of T campus, and I kept getting this impression that whenever I see white men, They look very effeminate. Their hair is painted green and so on. And when you see men, they're not white. They're Africans or Muslims. And I kind of thought, maybe you're just seeing things because you want to see them. So I didn't want to make much of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I went back again, and that was the same impression I got again. And then I started noticing it in my classrooms, that increasingly most men that are coming into our universities are really effeminized. And that the whole university environment nurtures that, praises that, and says that's the way to be,
right,
in one way or another. And women in universities, and I would say that it would be rare to find a woman in the social sciences, in the arts, who is not a feminist. So almost by definition, they are feminists. Therefore, that's the viewpoint they have of the world, that the emasculated male is the liberated male, is the male that we want. So they have promoted this. And in their teaching style, in the books that they choose to teach, in the way they talk about everything, that's the way it is. It is really, really, really bad what is going on in our universities, because it wasn't like that. British universities were really contesting masculine areas in the past. And these guys, were not brutish. They were taught manners, to be honorable, to have a sense of decency, not to let the worst of their emotions take over. They were taught to be disciplined. But it was very masculine in the contestation, in the sports, in the fact that you would have universities that were just men in them. And that has disappeared. And again, that's part of this whole widespread program to destroy Western civilization and destroy white men as viewed as the cause of all that is wrong in the world today. This is how insane they are. They don't realize that all that is good is actually something that white men produce. So they have it standing upside down. And another thing, too, that it has to be understood is that this emasculation is not really a product just of feminism. It's also a product of affluence. It has happened in the past. When cultural civilizations become wealthy, they become weaker because they're too comfortable. Things are easier. That happened to the Romans. I have an article on this in my blog. The Romans early on were incredibly tough, but by the time you get to Caligula, they are just perverted into sex. Yes, they're emasculated, and women at that time also became liberated. So this is a phenomenon that is beyond feminism, and we should see it that way. That in another way, I'm saying you cannot just blame men. It's just the very affluence of life nurtures that kind of character. Right. I'm soft. That's just the reality of it. In comparison to people that fought in the First World War, that fought before, they have harsher, tougher lives, and that creates a tougher person. It's just the way it is. So it has been getting worse and worse through time, and that is a product simply of affluence. It's not just an ideology. You could even argue that the leftist ideology is a byproduct of that comfort, easygoing lifestyle. Because if things were to get tough, if we were under an invasion, under deprivation, the next generation would have to get tougher. They just could not be lying on bed or sleeping too much or eating too much ice cream and cereal and that kind of stuff. They're going to have to really pull out from within themselves the stronger masculine instincts. And that may well happen. I mean, I hope it happens as Europeans struggle with this invasion.
Do you know of any specific instances, historically speaking, of civilizations or even nations that started to decay and become more effeminate and then had a resurgence in masculinity?
Well, it happened to the Romans. As I said, I have an article that I wrote last year on historical cycles. And what I argue is, in that article, is that the alt-right cannot do much about reversing the emasculation of men. That this is not a matter of reading books, of listening to alt-right people, that these are things that happen from the moment boys are very young. They get this kind of environment that breeds them to be weaker, to be softer, to be more emotional. And then feminism plays on that and adds to it and just really hammers against the masculine side. So it really makes it a lot worse in a way that it was never the case before. But you see it among the Romans. And the Romans themselves noticed this. Roman writers already, I was surprised, as early as the 2nd century BC, after they had won the second Carthaginian war and a lot of wealth came into Rome, some Romans were saying, guys, we're becoming weaker. We're not these tough-minded Romans. We're living in luxury in big cities. We don't want to farm as much as we used to. So it has happened in Rome. It's happening in Japan. You see families that were really tough. They climbed to the top. Then subsequently, the children and the grandchildren are weaker and weaker until they decay in a state of luxury. So you have to be aware of that reality, which is in many ways a natural reality in the sense that comfort breeds weakness. It has been known by everyone throughout history, and you cannot know that through common sense.
Right.
Nietzsche would say that. He would say, if you want to look for real men, go to a prison. You'll find really tough guys that have experienced a lot in life. Nietzsche already saw this. He said, this is what's happening, and this is what's going to happen. I don't think he could ever realize that it would get this bad. I mean, we have a situation in the West in which Muslims and other peoples will rape white women, commit terrorist acts, and they still are asking for forgiveness, and they go and put flowers and teddy bears and candles. That's their reaction.
Yeah.
If we were to do that in Russia, it wouldn't be the same. The Russians are still tougher, and the Eastern Europeans are tougher because they were protected and they live in more difficult circumstances within communism and through the Second World War, so they're tougher. And other peoples outside are tougher. But it is happening to all the peoples as they become affluent.
There's an agenda obviously at play on with some people with globalist mindsets, and they want to encourage mass immigration into the West, into countries like Canada and the U.S. and Europe. I guess to make people more easy to govern and to reduce nationalistic fervor that can potentially lead to violence, something like that. But do you think that in one generation, for me, an anxiety I have sometimes is that an Islamic society is much more masculine than the West, and it will just come in and sort of take over, and then I'll be shit out of luck. So is it possible that they'll come and then they'll become, in one generation, soft and comfortable like my generation currently is? Or is it much more dangerous that they're simply going to establish a stronger social norm, I guess?
they themselves have become softer, and one way to measure that is that they don't have as many children as they used to. But Islam is an ideology that privileges boys from the very beginning, makes them feel that they're special, and gives them the status in society. Now, that can have a drawback in that if you're special, there's not much that you need to do, but also gives them a confidence in who they are as men, what their identity is, a kind of confidence that white men are usually lacking today, and they don't get from anywhere. So they are more manly. This is quite obvious, and they are aware of that. They're very aware of that, particularly in the upper political levels, or the people who think about it. They know that, look at these Western peoples, how could they possibly have been great and done all the things they say they have done, created great empires and so on, and look at them, they're so weak and effeminate, and the women control them and so on. So they're kind of aware that something is going on. And when they go to Europe, they sense it, that the more they hit us, the more they get, the more they get promoted, the more the establishment says that they're going to celebrate diversity and they're going to fight Islamophobia. It has the opposite effect, rather than people going against them. So I think they're aware of that. I would say that that process of weakening, they are experiencing it as well, because it's something that happens physiologically as you grow up as a child and you have all your needs satisfied, candies and games and your